Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Wisdom Chat. I'm your host, Phill Holdsworth, and my wonderful guest today is Amanda Moore McCarthy, who is a counsellor specialising in areas such as neurodiversity, trauma, and abuse. Amanda, welcome to Wisdom Chat.
Hi, Phill, and thank you for this invitation today. Really appreciate your time, and thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure, Amanda, and I'm sure in our conversations prior to this, we've had some very interesting conversations. So I think what we're going to talk about today, our listeners will find quite beneficial. Before we go any further, though, Amanda, just tell our listeners a little bit about the work that you do.
Okay, so I run my own private practice, which is asset counselling, and my area of real interest is around neurodivergence, and working with trauma and abuse. I think I came into this for both personal and professional reasons. And my work with clients is helping them work through, I suppose, day-to-day experiences in life and challenges. I quite often have clients that will come to me with such as low mood and not necessarily depression, but just low mood and feelings of low self-worth. When we start to unpick it, we start to see some kind of like patterns, and some clients have been diagnosed, maybe that are on the autistic spectrum, or maybe dyslexic, or with ADHD or dyspraxia, etc., which is neurodivergence. And what we start to unpick what their life experiences have been, feeling, I suppose, like an outsider, feeling a bit different. Language that I get shared with me is that they feel weird, they feel that they've always kind of stood outside the circle rather than within it.
Yeah. So I'm just thinking there, Amanda, I get what you're saying about perhaps other people's perceptions and responses to somebody who is different to them, and they don't understand what that difference is, which really refers back to the neurodivergence. Just tell us a little bit about what is neurodivergence, and I suppose it relates to some of the things that you've just said. Just tell us a little bit about it.
So, a neurotypical individual is kind of like 75% thereabouts of the population. So the majority of population the brains would work in a neurotypical way. With a neurodivergent brain, it works in a different way. The way that they assimilate the world, the way that they experience the world, they different stimuli and things like that. So even though how they see the world is different, it's an incredible superpower. And we just really, I kind of feel we're just really on the cusp of this. But how we interact within the world. I myself am neurodivergent. I've not been diagnosed, but I'm very much aware through personal experiences of another family member and how this has kind of like evolved. So yeah, how the brain works just differently.
Yeah.
And
yeah. It's and I understand that because I remember a number of years ago, some friends of ours that we used to live sort of next door to have two boys who are autistic and varying degrees as well. But having said that, these two boys have gone on to achieve tremendous things at university and in the world of work. And so it blows away some of the perhaps perceptions that people have that, oh, you're different, that you'll not amount to anything. In actual fact, that's rubbish. And I like the term that you use, that superpower. And that's, you're not being flippant about it, I know, because I've heard that term many a time. But a superpower for one person might be their ability to retain information or process information in a way that perhaps others, like myself, may not be able to do. So there are all manner of differences. But what really struck me was these two boys was their ability to achieve, despite the fact they were diagnosed as being autistic or severely autistic. So is that sort of, akin to what you're really talking about in terms of put my teeth back in, neurodivergence?
Yeah, I think that I mean there's been so many so much research done over the last couple of years regarding autistic spectrum condition, and where we sit, I suppose, and with neurodivergence. So, for instance, it's considered that somebody who's got ADHD, so attention and hyperactive disorder, that they struggle to concentrate, but actually that's kind of the opposite, because they actually concentrate intensely on something of interest. And I recently read a book. I can't quote it at the moment because I don't have the information in front of me, but I recently read a book, and that's where it kind of comes into this superpower. But in many years ago, when we like maybe lived in tribes and that, somebody with ADHD would be a really important member of the tribe, because they would be the lookout, they would be doing the risk assessing, they would be guarding, they would be looking around and seeing where danger was and potential risk or threat. Really very clever at problem solving and stuff like that. So it's again, it's the way the brain will see things differently, and just how it's made up. And there's a lot of there's a lot of information out there about it being a shortcoming of a human being, but actually it's a huge strength. And there's a lot of masking that goes on, especially especially for adolescents, masking the behaviors, masking how things impact them.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting what you're saying about back in the days when we lived in tribes and so on, how that person who was neurodivergent would actually be quite a key person in their respective area. Because it was all about survival. It was all about keeping people safe. It was all about problem solving. And, because that was the need in order for the tribe to survive. And I think when you start to look at that, you start to realize that as a society, for however long, we have been building up this, you're different to me, so therefore you must be odd. In actual fact, it's not the case at all. And it brings us back to our, superpower. You are particularly good at X, whatever that X is. And we should recognize it and learn to be able to identify it. And so as an employer, quite often it could be really good to have some of these people who have got these superpowers actually employed within the company, because it can be a real asset to the company. That's kind of what I'm hearing more and more.
Absolutely. And I liked how you put the asset in there just at the right kind of time, whether it was purposeful or not. Absolutely incredible, playing to people's strengths. 70% of individuals that are employed that are neurodiverse, neurodivergent, 70% will experience some kind of mental health dip. That are in employment, and the strengths and their abilities, if they're in the right employment, I suppose maybe putting somebody with ADHD into an office working on a telephone, for instance, this is just my opinion, but put on a telephone may be incredibly confining and restricting for them.
Yeah.
But you put them in somewhere, like maybe outdoors, maybe, say for instance, a young person that's fantastic at football, that you put them in a classroom environment, and they're a young person who's got behavioural issues.
Yeah, it's I actually work in some of our local schools, and it's interesting what we need to do to accommodate people who it could be that they're neurodivergent. I don't necessarily know some of their backgrounds, but I recognize the fact that we're assuming that everybody's going to learn in a particular way, and it's not true. It's never been true. So why on earth do we promote it? I have no idea. But what it does do, it means that those who perhaps late developers or are more creative rather than academic are almost like marginalized, and are not encouraged to fulfill what they're capable of fulfilling. I know for myself, I was a late developer, and it wasn't till 11 years later, which I then started to find my true sort of forte in life. Whereas when I was at school, I was expected to fit within certain parameters. And sometimes those parameters didn't work for me, as I'm sure they don't work for many students today.
Absolutely. And I think, from if it's okay to just share a little bit of my own personal journey, mine probably started maybe about 7 or 8 years ago. And I know that when I was a child, I used to take this pink medicine, and didn't know what it were about, but I used to take this pink medicine. And I think when I got into my 20s, I found out it was because I had ADHD. So at that time, I didn't really take much notice about it, but I just remember being told and the connection, but it didn't make much sense. And when I reflected back, I did used to wander around from classroom to classroom, and I had children in my school that were older but that lived in the local neighbourhood, and I'd go into their classes, whether that was, I knew these children and stuff, but I couldn't concentrate, couldn't remain, and did move around a lot. I didn't have behavioural issues. I wasn't a troublesome child, but there was that attention span. But only as going back to the start of this particular part of the conversation, 7 or 8 years ago, a family member close to me were diagnosed with. I always say diabetes, and it's not. It's dyslexia. And when we had this assessment, when this assessment was carried out, it was brought to my attention that either myself or my husband, one of us, was dyslexic, and we had then this conversation that led me down a different path to kind of a discovery, really. And I started finding out things about myself that I had covered up and I'd masked. And then as things have moved on with my family member and where we're at now, through them I have learned a lot more about myself, and that in turn took me into this furthering this interest in neurodivergence and working with individuals and when they how they come and what they will bring. So for me, I for a long time thought, and it's a really hard word is this to use, and I don't use it sparingly, but I thought I was thick. That was it's like that was a term that I used myself. I thought I was thick. I've got a degree. I don't know how I've done it. I'm not an academic, but I managed to get there. In my previous career, I've been a social worker, and that's involved doing lots of assessments, lots of report writing, and some of the pains that I went through. Now I understand that is because of my dyslexia, my traits of ADHD that at my age now I've covered massively and I've compensated massively.
Yeah.
So when I work with clients who come through and start talking to me about maybe about the self-esteem and how the school life was, I kind of there's an understanding there. There's more thought processing for me when I'm working with this individual. What is going on for them?
Yeah, because of your own experience, I suppose you could call it empathy, the ability to sort of try and understand what it might be like for the other person, and know where they're coming from. As you were talking about, like, for example, ADHD, I was just reminded of, the competition, I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here.
Yeah,
Sam Thompson
yeah,
won this year,
yeah.
and he announced that he'd been diagnosed with ADHD, and he wanted to celebrate his ADHD. And I'm thinking more and more, sort of well-known people, whether they're celebrities, whatever they may be, are starting to talk about these things. Do you feel that the mindset of the general public is beginning to shift, in terms of how we think of and treat people who are neurodivergent?
I think it has to do because the mindset of those very people are the people that could very much so have be neurodivergent. So, for
Mm,
instance, you've talked about Sam Thompson. We know Paddy McGuinness's wife, Christine. She did a documentary a couple of years ago around her autism and her children's, and some massive life-changing events for them as a family, as a couple, and as a family. And I think that I think we're not going to sit down and be silent.
yeah.
And it's interesting because with my experience and that thinking that I just weren't intellectual, I didn't have the brain capacity, I just didn't, it took me into some dark places myself, and
Mm,
having to kind of like dig deep and get rid of work on these negative automatic thoughts that I was feeding myself. But now, as I work with clients who come and talk about the moods, and they come and share things, and
mm,
we start to unpick, there's I rarely share in my sessions. I try not to share about anything really, not too much about me, because it's not about me, it's about my clients. But we do, especially when the neurodivergence comes in. And when we talk about, so for instance, I know I drive my husband mad, and I have done for years, because I will start a job and not finish it. So we'll come home, and for instance, if it's housework, I'll have a Hoover that's been cleaned and it's in one area. I'll have dishwasher half full or half empty. I'll be washing machine will be half done, and there'll be little piles of clothes in areas and stuff. And but in my brain, it's fine. It's a kind of like sorted out mess, but for him, it's chaos. And again, these are things that I've accepted who I am,
yeah, yeah,
who I
yeah,
am. And it's
yeah.
also, in fact, it impacts your friendships as well,
Mm,
and sustaining friendships. That's something that people talk to me about, that they can struggle or find it challenging with some
mm,
friendships, and with ways of being themselves. If they be their
yeah.
real self, their authentic self, then they may be rejected.
Yeah. It's a difficult one, isn't it? Because when you think of a person who has a friend who's neurodivergent but doesn't necessarily fully understand them, you can kind of understand why at times they might pull away, because they just don't understand what's going on, and they might be facing their own challenges, and therefore it might feel like a bit too much for them to deal with their friend's difference. But from the friend's point of view, that must be very isolating and lonely at times, because the very thing that you need in, which is that connection with other people, it's a struggle to maintain that connection when people don't understand. I, I just wonder whether, as a society, people will say we're talking about mental health a lot more, neurodivergence, which is a term that's coming up more and more out there. And I often say, yeah, but are we talking about it at a personal level? What about my own mental health? What about my own? Do I have any neurodivergence? And I'm not saying that we're navel gazing, but certainly thinking we're all on a spectrum of mental health. We all have mental health, whether it's good, poor, or indifferent. We all have it. But do we appreciate that? And therefore, do we take time to think, well, just because they're different to me doesn't mean to say that they're any less a person than me or any more a person than me. It could be that they've got a superpower I don't have, but I might have a superpower they don't have. And it's having that mindset, isn't it, that doesn't divide, but actually still embraces and bring people together. Is that something you found yourself?
Yeah, and I suppose it's about seeing that difference as being it's different by way of it's positive,
Yeah,
rather than seeing neurodivergence, neurodiversity or autism as being debilitating. They're actually, if they're used, it's kind of like if you were to put a square wheel on a car, it's not going to move forward.
hmm.
You put a round wheel on a car, and if putting somebody in a work environment or an educational environment, so the educational system,
Yeah,
where you get into year 11, you sit exams,
yeah,
that is incredibly painful. So for some individuals, because
yeah,
sitting an exam, not only are they struggling to sit the exam, and they may get additional time and they may get a reader. However,
yeah,
unless you are a person that experiences this, sitting there and not being able to achieve your maths and English, because you just can't sit an exam, because the information
hmm.
in your brain, when it comes out of here and put on paper, there isn't there isn't that passover, there isn't that crossover. Then that impacts your mental health, your self-esteem, because your mental health, we live in a continuum. So sometimes things happen and it raises, sometimes things happen and it goes below, but we try to keep a level. And with an exam, that example with sitting exams. So,
Hmm.
we've got to sit as maths and English exams up until 18 and hopefully pass. If you can't sit your exam, if you just can't do an exam, it's like
Hmm.
asking, suggesting that, or saying that a fish can, swim up a tree, climb a tree. It's not going to happen. Putting them in the right environment,
Yeah, yeah,
and sitting an exam and failing, then that feeds into your core of yourself, and
hmm.
that feeds into that your identity, your
Yeah.
self-esteem, your
I
self-confidence.
This is the thing that really strikes me, is the fact that it's convenient, isn't it, to treat everybody the same, and yet we're not all the same. We're all different and unique individuals. I've seen it firsthand in exam situations where just entering the exam in itself is a traumatic experience, and people have had to have been really taken to one side and calmed down, and then actually walked in with somebody to the exam because the anxiety levels have just absolutely peaked. So that's one thing. I then spoke to a mother of a child who uh, can't sit exams, tried to sit exams, has to sit exams because we're told by the state that's how it's done, and now extending it to 18 as well. Um, and this person would fail each time. And you're right, the impact on that person's self-esteem is profound. And yet we insist on this way. So, my heart really went out for this individual. The good thing is they were very good in terms of their neurodivergence with music and musical instruments. And their passion was to play in a band. And so they've actually become very successful in that. Um, but I know some people that wouldn't be the case, and they would be just written off by society. And I just think something needs to change in our society to say everybody has value. There isn't a single living person on the face of this earth that doesn't have value. How they conduct their lives are entirely up to them, and whether we agree with it or not, again, it's personal opinion. However, that doesn't take away the fact that as a human being, they still have value, and it's really tapping into that. And how do we take that forward?
Absolutely. And when you look at, for instance, being assessed, So for autism, for a young person to be assessed for, whether or not they've got for an autism diagnosis, the waiting list is phenomenal. You're looking at years rather than months, and there is, there is the policies and procedures around it and stuff, but because there is such a high demand and such a I suppose a smaller group of professionals that are able to do it, but I think that I really do feel that society is changing, because this is not something to be afraid of. It's not something that's a bad thing. When going back 10-15 years ago, when you considered autism and that, it had a kind of, there were almost like a stigma about it, what it was. And I think that when you go back to the film with Dustin Hoffman, Rain Man, there's the assumption that autistic people are incredibly intelligent, and this is how they are. Yes, many are incredibly intelligent, many are average, and some will be below, like every part of society. But again, going back to the beginning, where play at people's strengths. But the other thing that I just want to add on, and I don't want to be too previous here, is that working, individuals that that I've encountered, especially with lockdown, we are looking at individuals that have been quite isolated and are experiencing loneliness. So relationship building.
And especially this time of year, it's extremely impactful on people who don't necessarily have family around them or a support network around them, to feel that the acuteness of that isolation even more. In a year when we're all talking about families getting together and celebrating the festive season, forgetting perhaps that there are those who are not able to do that, can't do that, for all manner of reasons. I just remember years and years ago, I had been away, living in Manchester for a time, and I was on a team in Manchester, but I wanted to come back to my hometown, which was Bradford, for Christmas. But my family was rather dispersed, so there was nowhere for me to really stay. So I spoke to a friend of mine who said, you can come and stay in my house. However, myself and others, we're all going home for Christmas. So I said, well, that's okay, as long as I've got, somewhere to stay. And so I arrive only to find there's no TV, no radio. I've got a single book with me, and there's very little food in the house. And at that moment in time, come Christmas Day morning, where there's no music, there's no sound, it's just me and a book, and there's no decorations, no Christmas tree, there's no presents under the tree. And I'm just sat there and I'm thinking, I never, ever, ever want to do this again. Never. I just, all of a sudden, it was just too painful to be alone at that point in time.
And as you're talking there, you can, for me, that was kind of just seeing how just observing you there, I can kind of like estimate the depth of that. And being able to empathise with people that are on their own, people that, the relationships with others are integral. And I know that, some people do like their own company, but loneliness and being lonely and being alone are two very different things. And loneliness is a big issue in our society, and more so now since we had the pandemic. And just to connect that with what we've been talking about previously, neurodiverse individuals and individuals with autism, there's almost this there's the thought process that these people that they don't want relationships, they don't want friendships, and that there's nothing further than the truth. They want to have these friendships not desperately, but they really want these friendships, but they don't know how to, and they don't know how to form the friendships possibly, and they don't know how to maintain them, and they're not quite sure how to behave. And I'm not trying to generalize there, but being alone and being lonely.
Yeah.
So for you was alone, and it led to you feeling lonely, and that feeling of loneliness,
Yeah.
you captured it almost briefly, but that was enough to kind of never ever want to go back there again. And also how that might impact others.
Yeah. It's interesting though, Amanda, as well, because years later, I find myself working in London a lot. So I'm traveling down to London every week and spending quite a bit of the week down in London working away. But at the end of the day, I made my way back to a hotel room, whereas others made their way home. And I remember saying to somebody I knew who's a friend who commuted in and out of London. And I said to them, I says, do you ever feel lonely in the city? And he says, oh, no, not me. And I started to think about it. I thought, I feel lonely. I discovered that you could be in the midst of crowds, but if people don't connect with you and you don't connect with them, you can be a really lonely person. Now, I appreciate what you're saying about, some people like to be alone and they need that time out, particularly if somebody is more of an introvert. They need to be able to escape from people. They need that sort of personal space. And I get that.
Yeah.
But I'm a quiet extrovert and I need connections. And connections to me are like my batteries. They charge me. And when I don't have those connections, so I could be in a city like London, not connected with anybody, outside of a meeting situation, finding myself back in my hotel room and extremely lonely. And that's what really impacted me. And it kind of shocked me as well that I've got this situation where years ago I'm on my own and I'm feeling lonely. But this particular occasion, I'm with millions of other people, but still feeling lonely.
Yeah, and again, it's that what you said there, that connection with another human being, and that you said about your batteries. I really like that example because it's kind of the batteries. Human connection is the battery charger, and it charges up your emotional pockets of your emotional pockets of that connection, and I don't know about you, but since lockdown, I started to appreciate them connections with human beings that I took for granted before. And it's almost like having a really good quality coffee or a really good quality glass of wine. You savor it, you remember it, and that for me now is about relationships. And for you. And then there'll be many people out there like that, having experiences, been surrounded by people, but yet been extremely lonely.
Oh, yeah. And I think it's very much that today, one of the side effects of COVID is people who still are anxious about going out and meeting other people, yet they need to because that disconnect is actually causing some real issues for them. And we talked earlier about mental health. And, mental health is a real problem. And I think I'm just conscious that time has passed us by. However, I would like to say this to our listeners, and maybe even a caveat to government, but to our listeners, if you are ever in a situation where you're feeling isolated, disconnected, lonely, there are things that, to be in that situation, you would easily spend time perhaps contemplating those circumstances you find yourself in, and that's not necessarily going to help you. It's not going to help you not feel lonely and feel connected to other people. So one of the things, and I don't know about you, Amanda, but one of the things I would probably say to our listeners is think about what you could do for somebody else. If you're with a family and you're together, but yet you know other people aren't, what could you do to make them feel connected? You don't necessarily have to invite them in for a meal necessarily, but what could you do? Even the simplest of acts could actually transform somebody else's life and just remind them that they are valued, that they are needed, that and they can be connected. But as an individual who perhaps is feeling those isolations, think about what can you do for somebody else? How can you bless somebody? How could you serve somebody? How could you just a little thing that would make somebody else's life so much more worth living? What could you do? And think of those things. And oftentimes as well, we forget about the positives in life when we're in a situation that we find challenging. So my challenge to you then would be, think about the positives. Be grateful for the things that have been good and positive and wholesome in your life, and be thankful for those things. That will certainly help in terms of your thought process. Instead of dwelling on all the negatives all the time, you're now dwelling on some of the positives, the things that you can be thankful for. Those are just a couple of things I'm thinking. I don't know about what do you think, Amanda?
Absolutely, and I just kind of wanted to mention, because on a morning when I get up and I'm slurping my coffee and just coming round and getting ready to take my dog for a drag around the village because he doesn't like to walk anymore because of his age, I find myself watching GMTV, and at the moment I think they're up to 160 million minutes that people are offering to give their time to people
Wow.
to make a phone call or maybe to go visit them,
Yeah.
and just around, not combating the loneliness, but to do just what you've said, what can you offer back?
Yeah.
And later today, I'm putting myself forward, and I'm going to speak to one of my children about putting themselves forward as well, because it could be a very simple phone call, but as you know,
Yeah.
if you pass somebody in the street and you smile and say good morning, and and it's not about having to be jovial and things, but if you just a pleasantry, good morning with a smile, that can make the difference to somebody's whole day.
Yeah.
And a
Yeah.
phone call, just checking in, how are they, can lead to it can take the dark greyness into a sunshiny, rainbowy kind of day.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fantastic, and you're so right with that, because I've heard of stories where people have been contemplating taking their own life, and it was because of somebody smiling at them or acknowledging them in some way that actually prevented them from going ahead with that decision. So yeah, thank you for that, Amanda. We're out of time, and Amanda, it's been a pleasure talking with you. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. Anybody who is wanting to talk to somebody, for you, Amanda, how could they get hold of you?
They can find me on LinkedIn. So I'm on LinkedIn, which it's Asset Counselling. Asset is spelled ASETT, so a safe environment to talk. They can go to my website, again, that's Asset Counselling, and Amanda Moore McCarthy. So if you want to contact me, it would be assetcounselling.co.uk.
That's brilliant. And I'll make sure that the links for those are with this recording as well. So it just leaves me to say thank you, Amanda, for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you. I hope our listeners have really got something out of our conversation. But if you do need to talk to somebody, then just remember you can get hold of Amanda Moore McCarthy at Asset Counselling. get that through LinkedIn or from a website. And if you're uncertain as well, you can always contact myself, Phill Holdsworth, at orumgoldltd.co.uk. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you very much, Amanda. You take care.
Thank you so much for your time, Phill, today. Thank you.
It's a pleasure.